So the JDK, the Java Development Kit, comes in many different versions. Now, usually, if you're actually installing software, the general rule is just to grab the very latest version and use that, and then if an update comes through, just update to that version. But things are not that simple with the Java Development Kit. Now, the reason is, firstly, we've got versions of the JDK that get released every 6 months, and after the 6 months they expire, then we've also got this other concept of an LTS version, which is a long-term support version of a JDK. So which version do you use? Confused yet? Well, let's go through which version you should be using in this video. But firstly though, speaking of long-term support, let's talk about a Java course with long-term support, my very own Java Masterclass. With 77 hours of video training, 320,000 students and tens of thousands of glowing reviews, this truly is the best way to learn Java. Grab a massive discount and instant access by visiting lpa.dev/YouTubeJava or by clicking on the link in the description of this video. Alright, so welcome back. So let's talk about what version of the JDK we should be using. Now note that there's lots of different vendors who each produce a version of their own Java Development Kit. We're not going to talk about that in today's video. Now we've got vendors like Oracle, Amazon, IBM, Red Hat, just to name a few. So they each produce their own version of the Java Development Kit, but using the same version numbers. So I need to create a separate video outlining which version, which vendor you should choose. In this video, we'll stick to purely the version number you should be using. So check out that video. You'll see that on this channel when I release it, which will be the next video after this one. Alright, for now though, let's look again, which I mentioned, at which version of the JDK you should be using. So a new version of the JDK gets released, as I mentioned earlier, every 6 months. Now when that new version is released, at the expiry of the 6 months, that expires. In other words, it's no longer supported, and another version is basically released which takes its place. And the thing to remember is with the older version, it no longer gets updated. So you need to be careful, obviously, in terms of which version you're choosing for that reason. Now, to give you a bit of a history, JDK version 9, well, that came out in September 2017. Then JDK 10 got released in March 2018. So at the same time, JDK 9 expired and is no longer supported. JDK 11, well, that got released in September 2018, but we'll come back to that shortly. So JDK 12 got released in March 2019, and JDK 13 is going to be released in September 2019, and JDK 14 will be released in March 2020. So going back to JDK version 11, I mentioned it was released in September 2018, but it's designated as the LTS or long-term support version of Java, and consequently is going to be supported with updates and commercial support if you want it until at least 2026. Now, the reason that I'm bringing all this up is that large companies, software development firms, but also large companies with an investment in Java will generally use this version, the long-term support version, because of that support, but also to ensure that they don't have to chop and change and their code base dramatically every 6 months. Now, supporting each release of a JDK might be minor for a relatively small code base if you haven't got a lot of source code. But if the existing code base is large, and obviously with a large company they've probably made a significant investment in Java over the years, it might be a significant effort just maintaining compatibility with new releases of the Java Development Kit. So basically these larger companies have to balance that against adding new features of the software, and that's obviously what their clients want. They're not particularly interested usually in which version of the JDK the software happens to be support or run under. They just want the new features that are being added. So for this reason, large companies will stick to JDK 11 as a rule, and that's because it's supported until at least 2026, but also there's no new features of the language introduced there. So they don't, in other words, they don't have to risk breaking compatibility with that source code. So in general, having said all that, my advice is for you to be using JDK version 11. Now the expiring versions, the new versions that are coming out, like for example JDK 12, they introduce minor features of the language, and obviously if you're sticking to JDK 11, then you won't be able to use those new features that are coming out in JDK 12 and 13. but the core Java language won't change that much in between the long-term support versions and the minor versions. So keep that in mind, and it's for that reason again that larger companies and your future employers will most likely be sticking to JDK 11. So think of JDK 11 for large companies as sort of a line in the sand, in that they can focus, again as I mentioned, focus on their product and new features they're adding to the code, and not having to sort of deal with maintaining or having compatibility with the newer version of the JDK. And of course, they've also got commercial support guaranteed to at least 2026. Now, speaking of the long-term support versions, I mentioned that JDK 11 is the latest long-term support version, supported to at least 2026. Well, the current model is to release an LTS support or LTS version of the JDK every 3 years. So consequently, the next LTS version, and that's JDK 17, is due September 2021. So in other words, in terms of supporting that long-term support, that would be the next base I suspect that most large companies would be focusing on. They'll be targeting the September 2021 release JDK 17 as the next time to update. So in other words, they'll move their code base from JDK 11 to JDK 17 at that point in time. So they've then got a fixed agenda that they can actually focus on, and they may even be on the side in between actually producing their software for their clients. They may even have some staff who are dedicated to just making sure that things are going to be ready for JDK 17. So that may well be what they'll be doing. But in any event, the thing is, my recommendation is to stick to JDK 11 right now. Now, I do realize that this isn't a perfect system, because obviously if you want to take advantage of some of the new features that have introduced, for example, JDK 12 has got a new switch expression feature, which is pretty neat. Well, obviously you can't use that sticking to JDK 11, but it's a bit of give or take there. You've got to take the good with the bad. So I think there's more reasons for you to stick to JDK 11, because that's more than likely what your future employer is going to be using when you switch across to them anyway. So I think JDK 11 in general is a good choice for most developers. And again, it's because most companies that you work for or go to work for will be using that. All right, so that's what version of the JDK that I recommend. And I actually said earlier in the video that I'm going to create another video, and it'll be coming up after this one in a few days' time. I'm going to go through the vendors, the major companies or vendors that produce JDKs. I'm going to help you decide which one you should go for. And I mentioned a couple of companies: Oracle, we've got Amazon, we've got Azure, OpenJDK, IBM, and so on. So it can get a bit confusing as to which vendor you should be choosing. But I'll go through the pros and cons and lead you hopefully to a decision on which way you can go. But keep in mind that again, with all these vendors, they still use the same release numbers. So in other words, they'll all have a JDK version 11 to stick to, and it's just their particular, what they've actually added to it. They basically can change a few things up within each version of the JDK. For example, there might be a different runtime that you can select that's got better performance from a particular vendor. But I'll go through all that in a future video. The bottom line is that now you know which version JDK 11 to stick to. So I'll see you in the next video. Amazing, you made it to the end of the video. If you're interested in more programming tutorials, click on the top rectangle over here. But if you're interested in programming tutorials, click on the bottom rectangle down there. And if you're interested in subscribing to this channel, and why wouldn't you be, click on the subscribe button up here. I look forward to catching you in another video.